welcome to everybody to our webinar this morning. A very warm welcome to all of you joining from wherever. I think we have quite a good treat in store for you in relation to our speakers this morning. My name is Ray Gaston. I'm a team vicar in the parish of Central Wolverhampton with responsibility for the Church of St Chad and St Mark. I also do some teaching in theological education. I've been asked just to facilitate today's webinar and also just to give a few opening remarks, which I will begin with. But before I begin those opening remarks, can I just thank Rachel, who is our BSL interpreter this morning, for her work with us to enable full participation. Our love is not authentic if it does not take the path of class solidarity and social struggle. To participate in class struggle not only is not opposed to universal love, this commitment is today the necessary and inescapable means of making this love concrete. For this participation is what leads to a classless society without owners and dispossessed, without oppressors and oppressed. So wrote Latin American theologian Gustavo Gutierrez in the first edition of his now classic, A Theology of Liberation, in 1971, as he sought to call the church through a dialogue with Marxism to side with the working class of the world in the fight for universal liberation against oppression and the hope of a world transformed through such struggle. 2 years earlier, Fred Hampton, proclaiming himself as a Marxist-Leninist, had invoked the same struggle in his speeches for the Black Panther Party in the urban centers of the United States of America, as he proclaimed, "It's a class struggle, goddammit," aligning the struggle of the Black working class in North America's cities against economic deprivation and murderous police violence to the anti-colonial struggles that were being undertaken by workers and peasants in the world colonized with similar violence by European imperialism. The 60s and 70s were also a time when there was an ongoing Christian Marxist dialogue that stretched across both sides of the Cold War divide in Europe and led people like the Dominican Herbert McCabe to proclaim in his essay Class Struggle and Christian Love, in a similar vein to Gutierrez, that the class struggle is not something we are in a position to refrain from. It is just there. We are either on one side or the other. What looks like neutrality is simply a collusion with the class in power. Despite it being well documented that the poor are getting poorer and the rich are getting richer, talk of class today in the church and wider society is often less radically framed. In the UK, post-Brexit culture wars often set the agenda for discussions of class, in which an exclusionary notion of the white working class is invoked for broadly right-wing political agendas. It sometimes appears that it is this discourse that drives some in the church hierarchy to talk of the church orientating itself more to the working class and looking for greater representation in leadership and presence in working class communities, more often than not with little space being given in the discussion to said communities, or a recognition of the diverse nature of the working class. In radical theology, it is now privileged theory and intersectionality, rather than Marxism and class struggle, that are the dialogue partners of theologians and activists attempting to address what has become classified as classism, a form of discrimination and prejudice alongside and interlinked with others, such as racism and sexism, rather than seeing class struggle as a process of universal social transformation, a la Gutierrez and Hampton. A recent essay in the latest Practical Theology by Victoria Turner entitled Interrogating Whiteness Through the Lens of Class in Britain, Empire, Entitlement and Exceptionalism is an interesting example of such intersectional work that draws on privileged theory and is rooted in an auto-ethnographical approach. Part of our explorations this morning might be to see how class struggle and intersectional approaches to class have been and can be interlinked. In the next hour, we hope through our speakers and your questions to explore the issue of the working class and the church, bringing their particular experiences and expertise to exploring dynamics of class in theology, church, and society. So on to our first speaker. Our first speaker is Reverend Dr. Monica Melanchthon. Monica is an academic dean and associate professor at Pilgrim Theological College, University of Divinity, who teaches Hebrew Bible / Old Testament studies. She is a graduate of the United Theological College, Bangalore, and the Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago, USA. Born and raised in India, she taught Hebrew Bible studies and women's studies at Gurukul Lutheran Theological College, Chennai, India, before coming to Australia in 2012. Monica positions herself as a feminist advocate and liberation theologian, committed to producing reflections and texts that resist and counter cultures and languages of dominance that exclude the voices of the oppressed. She has contributed toward developing Dalit and Indian feminist hermeneutics and theologies. Her approach to the biblical text is critical, contextual, interdisciplinary, and liberative. Today, she'll be speaking on the intersections of caste, class, and gender. Monica.
Thank you, Ray, and thank you, Eve, for giving me this opportunity to be with you this evening and to reflect on this rather significant topic. I speak today from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who have been custodians of this land from time immemorial. I pay my respects to the elders, past and present, as we work for right relationship with one another. I'm going to share screen. I have a few slides that I would like to show you or use. Okay. Okay. As you have just been told, I come from India, and that is the context that I represent primarily and speak into. I have only 10 minutes, so I'm going to try and say everything that I want to say. The empowerment line developed by the McKinsey Global Institute reveals that about 56% of Indians, that is close to 680 million, lack the means to meet their basic needs. And then there are another 413 million people who are vulnerable, who are just at the edge, so to speak, and can tip over in desperate circumstances. Sorry. Sorry. Okay. So I'd like to, first of all, call attention to this fact and to reiterate the fact that the majority of the poor in India are victims of cumulative injustice, economically, culturally, and politically. And it is the dimension of caste which is quite characteristic of Indian society, which makes the poor in India a group with a specific socio-cultural identity. If we were to apply Nancy Fraser's definition of injustice to the Dalit or the so-called untouchable community's condition, one can see that their experience of injustice is three-dimensional. First of all, in the area of it is distributive injustice, they experience maldistribution. Secondly, they are hindered from participating on terms of parity by institutionalized hierarchies of cultural value. caste plays a dominant role in determining where they can be and where they cannot be. And thirdly, the third dimension of injustice is in the political arena, because the Dalits or the poor have little or no representation in political and decision-making bodies. So the poor and the oppressed people in India are therefore not, sorry, where am I? Yeah, the poor and the oppressed people in India are therefore not a generalized category of unfortunate people. They are members of a socio-cultural group ordained and fixed as a particular caste or tribe who has remained in a deprived position for centuries. And so I'd like us to remember that they are not a statistical or economic category alone, but they are a social class as well. So the poor in India and the Dalits are often seen as a target group, targets of pity, analysis, at best compassion, at worst contempt, of being thought of as lazy, irrational, and culturally backward. So despite the fact that the poor are prone to accept this imagery, there is need to look at how the poor in fact cope with their social, political, economic, and cultural condition. Now, if people's participation is the slogan, I think what we need to aspire for is that the poor themselves are involved in the removal of poverty or in alleviating their condition. So, so what is the role of the poor or this particular social class in changing their condition? That is the question I want to ask. Now, as far as the Bible is concerned, the Dalit community recognizes the Bible as a potential, as a text with the potential to facilitate liberation. So therefore, it is justified to say that there is a distinct practical dimension to Dalit biblical interpretation. Okay, there is, they are very, very particular that every interpretation has something to offer for Dalit emancipation and Dalit liberation. Now, their ideas about the appropriation of the Bible are therefore quite functional because they are seeking the transformation of the Dalit situation. Now, Leslie Hobbs' book entitled Poverty in the Biblical World, in the conclusion asserts that biblical tradition is unanimous in asserting that material economic poverty is an outrage, that it should not exist, that it is not in accord with the divine will. Okay, so this is how he concludes his book. Now, so therefore, the tradition recognizes the evil of economic oppression, the biblical tradition. But in the face of this oppression, the tradition also affirms that God is the protector of those who are unjustly deprived of their access to the bounties of the earth and the fruits of their labor. So in liberation theology, you will have people talking about God as the protector who has a special place for the poor and the oppressed. But when you look at when you speak to the Dalit community and you listen to their experiences, they are cognizant of the fact that despite centuries of oppression, they have not really experienced the miraculous signs like in the Exodus narrative, disrupting the hierarchical and unequal social order in India. So therefore, Satyanathan Clarke, an Indian Dalit theologian who has written on Dalit issues as well, in one of his articles says, the notion of an all-powerful God who intervenes and completely reconfigures the world for the sake of the oppressed does not find a dominant place in Dalit thinking and acting. So, so therefore, I think it's important to recognize that the biases in the text have been exposed and the interests of the poor are not always articulated in the scriptures. Instructions and prescriptions cited with regard to the poor or the oppressed seem to be addressed to the haves or the rich. Such injunctions therefore create a situation of dependency on the part of the poor upon the rich, a top-down model of economics, contributing to a culture of receiving instead of ensuring an automatic sharing of resources or the creation of opportunities to become self-reliant, especially after the establishment of the monarchy in the Hebrew Bible. So it is a model that is intellectually and aesthetically satisfying to those of us who are comfortable. And apart from providing to us and that class a whole structures of privilege and status and lifestyle. So the question is, does the Bible contain an economic model that would suit the subaltern, the oppressed, the Dalits? And I am not sure. It is not certain that such a model, at least one that is explicit, can be found within the biblical witness. So Max Stackhouse, an American ethicist, writes, "It is no more possible to derive a contemporary normative economics directly from the pages of scripture than it is to derive a biology from Genesis, a platform for democratic politics from Amos, a medical ethic from Luke, or a university curriculum from the letters of Paul." So, therefore, you will find that these thoughts are echoed in the writings of other scholars as well. Levinson, for example, writes, "Biblical thought mandates but does not expect the abolition of poverty within history. Instead, it expects that these commandments of generosity will continue in force, that they will not triumph over the need for them." And this curious relationship between generosity and poverty is succinctly put in Deuteronomy, where it is commanded that there shall be no poor, and yet predicts there shall be among you no needy. So, therefore, the challenge that I would like to pose for all of us is, what principles might we apply to read texts of the Bible in particular that will enable us to identify strands of resistance among the vulnerable within the biblical text, which might aid the poor today or in our locations in their own struggles of liberation. And so I have some suggestions that I have drawn from my work also in feminist interpretations of the Bible to employ hermeneutics. So suspicion, whose perspective is it that is being projected within the text, whose perspective dominates the text. Does the text challenge or destabilize or subvert the subordination of the poor, or does it strengthen or reinforce it? Does it reflect appreciation and respect for the poor's experience and acknowledge their capacities and agencies? And this applies to our interpretations as well. And are our interpretations sensitive to the context of the poor? And I think our approach to the biblical text, therefore, needs to be critical in order to engender resistance, transformation, and liberation of the poor, on whose behalf we read and interpret the biblical text. So I think, as far as the church's response to the poor is concerned, one of the, from the perspective of my own work, I believe reading the biblical text and interpreting it in ways that will be beneficial for the poor is perhaps the first step to take. So I'll stop because 10 minutes are up and say more in the discussion. Thank you, Ray.
Ray, microphone.
Sorry, I didn't realize the last 2 minutes you haven't heard anything I've said. So I just thanked Monica for her contribution, and we're now moving on to our second contribution, which is from Dr. Robert Myles, who is a New Testament scholar from New Zealand, who is resident in Perth, Western Australia. He was appointed senior lecturer in New Testament at Wollaston Theological College from July 2021. His writing focuses on the historical formation of the early Jesus movement and the socio-economic realities of first century Palestine. Robert has published widely in historical Jesus studies, gospel studies, particularly Matthew, and on the ideological context of contemporary New Testament research. Today, he'll be looking at class struggle in the New Testament. Robert.
Thanks very much, Ray. And I also want to thank Eve for inviting me to participate in this webinar today. It's definitely a privilege to be given this opportunity to converse with you all today. So as Ray said, I'm a New Testament scholar, and I'm going to use my 10 minutes to briefly just sketch out some of the major projects that I've worked on. My research is mostly focused on Jesus and the Gospels, in particular the Gospel of Matthew. And I'm particularly interested in the socio-economic factors that converged to influence and shape the emergence of the early Jesus movement. And I suppose attempting to understand and unpack our biblical texts as a response or a reaction to underlying class conflict within their original historical contexts. I mean, I'm also quite interested more generally in political approaches to the Bible, including the reception of the use of the Bible as a political tool or resource, say in liberation theology and you know, the other forms of ways in which the text is read today. So my PhD work, which I did at the University of Auckland, it was published as a book in 2014 under the title "The Homeless Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew." And this is really, when I was working on this 10 years ago, really where my interest in class, actually, I didn't really have much of an interest in class before working on that project, but this was really where that came to a fore. And within this study, I really interrogated the ideology of and the kind of the assumptions that people make and the way that people interpret our texts, our biblical texts, when they talk about Jesus's homelessness, his itinerancy. People often imagine that Jesus's ministry was, for all practical purposes, an itinerant one, a homeless one. Jesus travels from place to place, usually by foot, as he goes about teaching of the kingdom of God, performing healings, exorcisms, the odd miracle, and so on. But in applying a hermeneutic of suspicion, I argued that Jesus's itinerancy is often romanticized in modern scholarly and popular interpretations of his life. It's something that he often chooses to enact voluntarily as a kind of chosen lifestyle. And for me, this really resonated with neoliberal ideas and myths about individual agency and social mobility, the ideas about modern homelessness, or propaganda about modern homelessness as a chosen lifestyle. And I suggested that this was read back into the frame of Jesus's own itinerant ministry, but it's kind of made good. There's a contradiction there, and because Jesus is the hero of the story, we see his homelessness as a good thing. He identifies with the poor rather than emerging from the lower classes himself. So to really move against this trend that I saw within modern interpretations of Jesus's itinerancy, I read several texts from the Gospel of Matthew, looking at the ways in which broader socio and economic forces were preempting cases of itinerancy and displacement. More recently, and kind of really developing some of the initial ideas in that book, I edited a collection of essays under the title Class Struggle in the New Testament. Number of essays by prominent and emerging scholars, looking at various aspects of the socioeconomic context of Christian origins and New Testament studies. And it was very interesting, actually, in Ray's opening remarks, as some of the points he made there resonated with some of the motivations that I had behind this project. Specifically that interpreters of the New Testament appeared in recent decades to have moved away from class. There's been a sort of retreat from class. It's become a bit of an unfashionable category. It's perhaps a bit clunky and obtuse. Better to talk about status and the way in which one's status might have be, I guess, more intersectional. So one might come from a low class position, but be highly educated, or this sort of thing. In that book, we kind of pushed against that by suggesting that class analysis has typically meant a lot more than just the performance of a status or an identity, but really needs to be understood within a broader context of the struggle over resources, ideas, and power. And another pushback in recent decades against the use of class analysis, particularly of the New Testament, is the suggestion that, and it's true, that particularly Marxist class analysis is concerned primarily with the conflict between the bourgeoisie or the middle class and who own the means of production, and the working classes or the proletariat. It comes from modern industrial capitalism, and it shouldn't be transposed in this kind of cookie cutter way onto our ancient texts. And so, again, we attempted to really flesh out the social and economic system of Jesus's day, of the New Testament times, where and I hope I'm really not stating the obvious, but it does need to be stated that Jesus didn't live in a capitalist society like ours. He lived in an agrarian society, one in which land constituted the primary means of securing wealth, but also that within that economic system there was no middle class, just a very small elite, some middling groups, and then the vast majority of the population living at subsistence level. Most recently, I've just finished writing a book co-authored with Professor James Crossley entitled Jesus, A Life in Class Conflict. And this book should be coming out later this year. And this is a book on the historical Jesus. And in this book, we're really attempting to answer two questions. What can we know about the historical Jesus and his movement? And the second question, how can we understand the emergence of Jesus and the Jesus movement in terms of class conflict as a driver of historical change? And we argue that the Jesus movement itself, and we tend to talk about the Jesus movement rather than Jesus the individual, because we're pushing it back against this sort of bourgeois great man view of history that focuses on the exploits of individual people, and we're more interested in the broader social movement from which Jesus was formed as a leader. But we suggest that the early Jesus movement appears to have been reacting against quite massive socioeconomic changes and upheavals that were taking place in first century Galilee. Specifically, Herod Antipas, who was the ruler of Galilee at the time of Jesus, he had engaged in a number of urbanization projects. In Sepphoris, which he rebuilt as Jesus was growing up. And as Jesus was becoming an adult, he built the major city of Tiberias, which was named after the Roman emperor on the Sea of Galilee. Now, according to the Gospels, Jesus never went to either of these major urban cities. But you find in historical Jesus research all kinds of speculation that, oh, you know, it would have provided opportunities for work and so on, and Jesus might have traveled the 6 kilometers from Nazareth to Sepphoris to work on some of these building projects. And that might very well be true. I mean, we can't say conclusively without more evidence. But we want to give, I suppose, a more rounder picture of what those urbanization projects would have meant for your ordinary peasants living in the villages in the countryside. And I think that these urbanization projects would have been a bit of a double-edged sword. While some peasants would have certainly benefited materially from the changes, employment opportunities and so on, others would not fare so well. Alongside increased demands and competition on their time and labor, sat the possibility of land dislocation to make way for these changes, resulting in the creation or perpetuation of landless peasants, precarious day laborers, indebtedness to landlords, banditry, and so on. The kind of things that the Gospels often seem to be quite concerned about. And of course, Josephus, the ancient Jewish historian Josephus, makes a number of comments about how this all happened as well. So we look beyond the New Testament Gospels in terms of reconstructing this picture of early 1st century Galilee. Fundamentally, there was this unequal distribution of prosperity and wealth created by these urbanization projects, which would have aggravated the underlying class conflicts between the elite and non-elite. And I suppose a lens for looking at this issue has been the dynamics at play in modern societies where, for example, gentrification and urbanization typically goes hand in hand with the perpetuation of this divide between the rich and the poor. Within gentrification, for example, you know, there are working class people who do have genuine opportunities for social ascendancy, and such individuals can become poster boys or poster girls or whatever as shiny examples for the elite. But of course, many others whose lives and communities are often disrupted and fractured and destroyed have very different experiences. So in coming back to the New Testament text and the Gospels, we very much see Jesus's apocalyptic response and the Jesus movement's apocalyptic response as responding to this crisis of a changing Galilee. All right, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. I'll move straight on to our third speaker, who is Dr. Chris Shannahan. And Chris is Associate Professor in Political Theology at the Centre for Trust, Peace and Social Relations at Coventry University, just down the road from Wolverhampton here. Chris is an urban political theologian whose work is grounded in his grassroots experience. His research focuses on theological responses to poverty and inequality, diversity and racial justice, and faith-based political activism. His publications include 2 monographs exploring these issues, Voices from the Borderland from 2010, and A Theology of Community Organizing from 2014. Today, he will also be discussing his research on life on the breadline. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you very much indeed, Ryan. And just a quick question, can you see my presentation?
Yes.
Lovely, that's grand. The Life on the Breadline, Christianity, Poverty and Politics in the 21st Century project ran from 2018 to 2021, and I want to share just one or two insights very briefly over the next 10 minutes or so on that project, coming out of that project, that hopefully connect in with this morning's presentation, this morning's theme. So thank you, Eve, for the invitation to share with you, and thank you, Ray, for chairing our session. I'm talking about the context of the UK. Our Life on the Breadline project, which was the first academic theological project to explore Christian responses to austerity age poverty, or poverty in the UK since the financial crash, has shone a light on an issue that theologians, to be fair, have been behind the curve in responding to in relation to our social science colleagues. I think theologians are playing catch up in relation to austerity age poverty in the UK. You'll see the context within which I'm speaking, the context within which we've developed our Life on the Breadline research. I don't need to rehearse those stats for you. They are deeply depressing, stretching back over the last decade, a picture of poverty in Boris's breadline written. Two questions, however, as we look at those stats. What implications do they have for church leadership, for church life and church practice? And does the church really genuinely get it? Does the church understand in its bones what this feels like? In order to respond to that question, I wanted to share three very long reflections with you in the next 30 seconds. So just a kind of a bullet point. I think it's vital that we broaden our understanding of poverty. We need to think about poverty in much more multidimensional, much more multifaceted terms than we often have done within theology or within the church. Firstly, poverty is intersectional. We've been working in Life on the Breadline with an artist, Beth Waters from Bristol, and that image of the jigsaw that Beth created for us speaks to the intersectional, overlapping, multidimensional, multifaceted nature of poverty. It's a complex jigsaw, something that Martin Luther King Jr., when he was going to receive his Nobel Peace Prize, compared to an octopus with many tentacles. But we've discovered that too often the church engages with just one face of poverty. Too often we reduce poverty to food banks. However important they may be, they are not an isolated phenomenon. Secondly, poverty is not, in spite of some of the ancient Victorian hymns that we might still sing, in spite of the accusations of successive governments, red and blue in the UK, poverty is not about individual failure. Poverty is not about moral inadequacy. It's systemic, as Gutierrez reminds us. It's a form of systemic sin or structural injustice. But too often, in spite of the fact that the churches in the UK committed themselves in the marks of mission to transforming structural injustice, too often the church responds only to individual need and fails to respond to a structural problem with a systemic response. And thirdly, poverty is a form of violence, a form of slow violence. I've written about that in my 2019 article, but drawing very much on the work of Gutierrez, who compares poverty to a form of slow death, and to the work of the peace studies pioneer, Johan Galton, who talks about poverty as a form of direct cultural and structural violence. But too often, the church, in our experience, fails to challenge the cultural tropes that underpin poverty in a UK context. We could say more, perhaps we will in a few moments, but let's move on to one of the things that we discovered in Life on the Breadline. During Life on the Breadline, between 2018 and 2021, we developed 6 case studies in Birmingham, London and Manchester, interviewed national church leaders from 13 different denominations in the UK, and surveyed regional church leaders from England, Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales, and developed a national poverty consultation with our partners, Church Action on Poverty. On the basis of that work, we identified 6 broad and sometimes converging and overlapping approaches to Christian responses to poverty in an age of austerity in the UK. I won't say too much more about them now, but you can see there the caring response, the classic welfare-based love thy neighbour food bank approach. You can see, however, that the comparable approach that is often not recognised, the approach of social enterprise, local churches, not least one of our case studies in Hodge Hill in Birmingham, working on asset-based community development, supporting the development of social enterprises, often but not always amongst younger unemployed women and men. Then we have the classic campaigning approaches, campaigning for structural injustice such as a living wage that churches have been in part participating in. Then we found a more of a conservative, behavioralist, individualized self-help approach to action on poverty, found particularly in conservative evangelical churches in the UK and in Black Pentecostal churches. And that area of our work was led by my colleague and friend, Professor Robert Beckford, who argues that education and economic and business training form a key part in the Black church's response to, Black Pentecostal church's response to poverty, a way of lifting individuals out of poverty. We move to advocacy, the speaking of truth to power locally, regionally and nationally. And then, even though we may not want to admit it, we discovered in our research that that prosperity gospel, forgive my crude summary, if you're poor and you believe enough and you put money on the plate and you come to our church, God will bless you, not just in the hereafter, but in the here and now. The preaching of false hope has gained traction in many socially excluded communities, not least in the UK. Whistle Stop Tour through some of the insights that came out of Life on the Breadline over the last 3 years. So what does that imply for our understanding of theology, engagement and social change? 1 or 2 questions just to throw out. Does the church genuinely hear cries of lament from excluded communities? Or is the church a social escalator, a middle class club essentially? What happens when the church appeals to the common good? What happens when the common good is not good enough? What's the calling of the church in the face of structural injustice? And where was God when Grenfell burned to the ground, or when people lost their £20 universal credit payments? Questions that we need to face again and again as we think about the intersections between class, ethnicity, poverty, gender, and the ways in which austerity policies have not impacted us all equally. In spite of what former Conservative Chancellor George Osborne said, we have not all been in this together. So what's that mean? On the basis of our research and our forthcoming church leaders report, I want to suggest very briefly 5 pointers. We would suggest that the church and academic and church-based theology stand at a kairos moment in the UK, a moment of judgment and opportunity. We need to stop talking and to move from an individualized appeal to the common good to a prophetic preferential option for the poor. Secondly, arising from our research and interviews and surveys alongside church leaders, we need to recognize the power that remains in worship and Christian education and prayer to challenge the hegemonic cultural violence that underpins existing injustice and poverty, and to preach and preach and preach again a new liberative narrative to win what Gramsci calls that cultural war of position. Thirdly, the church as an agitating minority, to quote Kenneth Leach from a number of years ago, is the church ready to use its unrivaled social capital up and down the land to transform structural injustice locally, regionally, and nationally? If we are, then we need to think about what form the church takes. We need, it seems to me, to develop an ecclesiology that is a yeast-like, bottom-up solidarity, an asset-based community development ecclesiology, rather than the national top-down church of, church with, church for the poor, or in my Methodist tradition, church at the margins initiatives. This is a long-term commitment, as Gutierrez reminds us. And finally, we need to move from a well-meaning but disengaged institution to a liberative social movement. And then finally, in closing, just one or two places that I hope you can find some more resources from the work we've done in Life on the Breadline. You can check out the Life on the Breadline website. We're currently working with a number of churches and the Joint Public Issues team who are using our Lent course. Some have signed up to our anti-poverty charter, and our church leaders report is due out any day now. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you to all our three speakers for, in their different ways, challenging and inspiring talks. I'd like to, rather than sort of open, we had some prepared questions, but because time is running short, I really want to give priority to any questions that are busting from the 106 or so people who are on this webinar. If you put your questions in the chat, I think Eve has sort of flagged how to forward your questions, and if Eve would like to sort of share with me any questions, then I can put them to our speakers. Maybe while I'm waiting, we could ask one. Oh, hang on. First question I've got here from Graham Boland, who asks, how does the church, and particularly the leadership of the church, move from talking about the poor as an other? And few people, at least in my diocese, he says, come from poor backgrounds. Chris, do you want to kick us off with that? Is that kind
of course.
Some things you were saying.
Yeah, of course. Thanks. I think it's important to start very briefly just by saying that what we discovered is that the picture is uneven across different Christian denominations. So I think sometimes in conversations when we talk about the church, that can, in a UK context, in an English context, be reduced to the Church of England. And I think it's absolutely the case from our experience that within the Church of England, the Methodist Church, and a number of other comparable white-led churches, that exactly what's been pointed to is the case there. However, it remains the case that in a number of other Christian denominations and traditions in the UK, that there is a stronger and more organic connection between leadership and people from working class communities. I think that is something that needs to be developed further. I think the question, however, is whether the church itself is disengaged from the raw realities of class. I think of working class life in the UK. I think it absolutely is. I think there's a question, however, though, about the extent to which the church in the UK ever was genuinely working class. I wonder if that's a bit of a myth in some respects. I'm trying to say lots of things in a very short space of time.
Okay, if you want to come back, I'll just move on to Monica to give her a chance to respond to that question. Monica? You need to unmute yourself, Monica.
Yeah, in my experience, it is not beneficial to speak about, to make a distinction between the poor within the church and the poor outside, because the experience of the poor within the church is very similar to those who are not part of the church either, you know. And so many of the experiences of the poor who are within the church are similar to the experience of the poor overall. And so the question for us in India is what can the church do when structural injustice has also seeped into the church, and those divisions are maintained and nurtured by the leadership? Am I making sense?
Yes. Thank you. Robert, do you want to respond to anything to that question?
Not too much to add, other than just I guess a gesture of encouragement that yeah, I understand what it's like to be within a kind of more prosperous or relatively prosperous setting, where and living in such an environment, and particularly if the institution of the church and the leaders within the church, you know, are very comfortable with a particular style of living, that the sorts of questions that we're discussing today are not seen as a priority or a pressing issue for the church. So I totally understand that, but you know, we have to do what we can to try and push back against it.
I think I would echo that, Robert, from a UK context. I mean, certainly what we've discovered is a sense of well-meaning disengagement, as I say, and that's not necessarily a judgment on individuals. I think it's more a comment, perhaps, as Monica was suggesting, on the kind of the extent to which many, not all, but many Christian communities can become disengaged from the rawness of poverty, almost that sense of church as a kind of a social escalator. I think a counter to that in the UK context is a model of ecclesiology that turns dominant ecclesiologies on their head and takes a much more long-term asset-based community development approach. And I think that that's a model of community building, but I think it's also potentially a model that can be used to think about church leadership. I do wonder, though, however, those national initiatives like Church at the Margins, Church of the Poor, potentially even asset-based community development itself, the extent to which those movements are certainly Church at the Margins, Church of the Poor, are more about church growth and the survival of the institutional church in poor communities than they are about the gospel calling to reflect a preferential option for the poor. Is it about institutional survival, or is it about liberative approaches to social justice? I suppose that's my question.
Thank you. I'd really like to come into that conversation, but I won't, because maybe we can pick it up afterwards. But another question, which I think relates to some of this, but in a very different way, is like, how can the Theological Academy talk about class without adopting the meritocratic practice of only giving voice to working class people who made it out, so to speak, through the very education systems which oppress their siblings? Maybe throw that one to Monica to start off with, or
maybe someone else should.
Okay, Robert, do you want to kick off on that one, Robert?
I mean, it's a good point.
I think we need to hold our hands up, actually. Yeah, it's a fair cop.
Yeah. I think you know, in terms of from my own perspective and my own research, we have traditions and we have histories of working class people and of oppressed groups that we need to recover and try and give voice to. And I think that's part of the, I suppose, the hermeneutic orientation that I'd take towards the New Testament. So in that sense, I hope, even though it's a kind of semi-elite or elite academic enterprise that we're engaging in, I at least hope that we're doing something to cut against the idea that we're only allowing some people to speak and others will never get a chance to speak.
I think that's an issue within theology. I mean, I would hesitate to suggest this, but potentially not just theology within the academy, but potentially theology within a theological college and theological education context as well. I think too often we can wag our fingers at academic theology and imply that theological college or theological education is a million miles further down the road. I don't know if that's always the case, but in a university context, I would suggest that it's not just an issue that theology has. I think it's a much bigger issue about the culture and the context of higher education and what that does, what that institution, what that experience does and expects, and the power that it exerts. There's a longer conversation there, but I think theology is part of that picture, but it's not reduced to theology. It's something about the culture and the context of higher education, certainly in the UK context, I think.
Yeah. I would say in the institution that I served in India before I came, it was a part of the mission of the institution and its vision was to actually equip students who had come to be formed for ministry in becoming aware of the context, and so analyzing the social and the political and the economic life of the region in which they were placed, and to be able to offer a theological response to that. So I think students may have come with many of them may have come with little ideas of what needs to be done, but once they had finished their education and returned to congregations, they knew that this was a significant part of their ministry, to be aware of what was happening around them, and therefore to apply the tools that they had been given to analyze the context in which they were placed, and to discern the needs of the community and to respond to them appropriately. It is true that those of us who are within the academy are people of privilege, but I think I would say that here faith is if you are a person of faith and a practicing Christian, I for example will say that it is part of my calling as a Christian to be the voice of those who are voiceless, and to ensure that the work that I do speaks to their needs. So there's a component of advocacy in the work that I do, and I think that's what ministers should become, advocates as well.
Thank you. I've got one last question, I think, which from Lucy Dallas, which says, in England, social class is as much about how people are valued as poverty. Spoken accents, family names, etc., are taken as badges of belonging within a social class, regardless of money. This is true of the church too. How does the church overcome this aspect of its classism, she says? I think that kind of takes us back to some of the discussion, some of the points I think Robert and myself in my presentation were raising about some of these issues. I mean, Robert, do you want to kind of pick up on that in some way to start off with?
Yeah, the word or the term classism sort of grates for me, because while I understand and I agree actually with the point that Lucy is making and the question that she's asking there, classism is this kind of way of talking about class as an identity, and as something that, and I think as Lucy rightly kind of identifies there, it's to do with, you know, the spoken accents, the family names, and all these kinds of, it's the measures of an identity. And how do we overcome discrimination against that particular classed identity? Now, that's a great question. But when I'm talking about class, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the struggle between, you know, those who own, the class that owns the means of production and the class that doesn't. And the attempt to, I suppose, overcome those antagonisms within society. And I don't think it is necessarily going to be achieved through, you know, being more inclusive or less discriminatory, as good and as those things are. And, you know, we should be doing those things, but not to the extent that they become a distraction from actually engaging in actual class struggle and attempting to, you know, improve people's working people's socioeconomic positions.
Thank you, Robert. Does either of the other two want to add anything before we come to a kind of close in relation to that particular question?
Just to say that I think Lucy makes a very good point. I mean, I would agree with what Robert was saying. I think I would add that Lucy's comment and reflection there reminds us of the complexity of class. It is about the means of production, it is about economics, but to put it simplistically, in churches, are some working class people more equal than others, as it were? So those issues to do with the intersectional overlapping nature of our identities, I think, are maybe part of what's behind what Lucy's hinting at there. But that's another workshop.
Thank you, Monica. So,
yeah, I mean, there is a question here in the chat that is asking if we are using poverty and class as synonyms, and I don't know if we want to clarify that.
They can be. I think they can be synonyms, but they don't have to be.
okay, thank you. I think we can draw it to a close there. Can I just ask, there is a request from a couple of people if people's slides could be made available for the participants. I don't know if that's possible, if Eve can say whether that's possible, that she can send those out to all the participants, and if the speakers who use slides would be willing to share their slides, if they could give sort of whether that's, and that's that, I suppose that's for a discussion between them and Eve, and then if they are willing to share them, they can be shared. Is that right, Eve? They can be shared, and then we'll just kind of...
Very happy to share if as long as the speakers are. Thank you.
I mean, I sent mine to Eve just before we started, so I'm happy for them to be shared to whoever would like to see them.
Thank you. So, well, a big thank you to all our speakers for the time this morning, and big thank you to Eve for all the organisation in getting this together, and a big thank you to you for all your participation. Some people's just said there in the thing, we need longer webinars, and I agree. When I was told this is an hour, and the speakers who were on it, I kind of thought, wow, could you an hour? So yeah, I mean, so maybe that's something for the organisers to reflect upon. But thank you all very much for your involvement and your time. Just to say, I think that the next webinar from the Common Awards will be in April, and information about that will be coming out in the near future. So thank you all very much, and have a good day.
And thank you, Ray.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.